curriculum co-chair for this past virtual convention that NAHJ and NABJ had together. And last but not least, we have Mihir Zaveri, who is the president of SAJA and a reporter at the New York Times. He has also served on the board of AAJA. So before we go into this, I kind of want to set the stage for this conversation we're having tonight with an understanding of what this past year has meant for journalism. Obviously, a lot has changed. Just the fact that we are all meeting on a Zoom, probably in our bedrooms or living rooms, is an indication of that change. But beyond the pandemic and its widespread impact, journalism has experienced a reckoning of some kind in the past few weeks. So I kind of want to start with Kat and why do we think it took a global pandemic, a civil rights movement, a recession for news organizations to kind of feel the pressure that they're feeling now to adapt more to the communities that they cover and to the journalists that they employ? Do I have to unmute her? Yes, there you go. Sorry, Kat.
Sorry, I was like, can you understand what I'm saying? So, well, that's a great question, first off, and thank you so much for this invitation. I think it's an important discussion to have. But when I think about this moment, you know, I've kind of been talking about it as if the nation right now is facing three crises at once, right? The health implications of the pandemic, plus the economic fallout, and then this reckoning around race and police brutality and all of that, three things happening at once. And I kind of feel like it came to like this pressure cooker point where it was impossible to ignore. I don't think we've ever before in the history of this nation had these three things, pandemic, you know, on top of all these other things happening all at once. So it's just this convergence of these hopefully once in a lifetime type-esque events that made it impossible for our industry to ignore. And I've kind of been thinking about it through the lens of how after the riots in, you know, the 60s, how, you know, newspapers then, journalists then were struggling with how to cover that unrest, right? They couldn't even figure out how to characterize whether to call it a riot or uprising, right? It's the same thing that's happening now. I just think that people were forced to do it. Now, am I optimistic that we will see systemic change come of this? I'm not quite certain. I think it's too early to say. We've seen a lot of newspapers, we've seen a lot of, you know, media companies do all of these performative announcements. You know, we're going to capitalize the B in Black. We're going to do all of this. We're saying Black Lives Matter. But for me, until we start to see them hiring people of color, and not just hiring us, but retaining people of color, for me, it's meaningless, right? Because I want to see intention behind these words. So will we see some change? I don't know yet.
Yeah, you answered my next question of like whether this reckoning has actually begun or it is what is just tweets on social media. But like you said, we'll have to wait and see if there's actually any long-term change. I want to go to Julia. So Julia, you've been Julie, you've been a part of AAJA for a while. How do we define allyship in the newsroom and what it means to be an ally, especially, I mean, this conversation we're having, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is the first time that this many minority journalism organizations are coming together to address one thing that impacts all of us, obviously some more than others, but what does being an ally mean and what does it mean as being in a journalism organization?
Thanks for that question. I think there's so many ways to look at allyship, which is why you have this question in the first place. What does it mean to be an ally? And are we all using the same definition? So some of the work that that KQED has been doing that is part of this work stemming from the reckoning and stemming from these conversations being directly addressed is this conversation. Like, are we all using the same language? Do we all have the same definition? So for allyship, and I really want to shout out one of our HR directors, Dasha Mitchell at KQED, for really bringing to my attention this definition from PeerNet BC. It's one that really resonates in me and actually puts to words a lot of ways in which I view allyship, which is that it's not, first and foremost, and I've always thought this and I've never really articulated it, is that it's not an identity. It shouldn't be something that is self-defined, but rather is what the work actually really means. And so the definition of allyship is an active, consistent, and I'm reading, and I'm happy to share this link with folks, is an active, consistent, and challenging practice of unlearning and re-evaluating, in which a person of privilege seeks to work in solidarity with a marginalized group. It's not an identity, it's a lifelong process of building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability with marginalized individuals and or groups. So this kind of work and the efforts must be recognized by the people we seek to ally ourselves with. And this to me just really provides a constructive framing for us to be doing the kind of work that we want to be doing and making decisions on the time investments and the brain power that this work truly requires. Something that Kat said nudged this idea that always surfaces for me when I see diversity efforts in newsrooms, which is that ultimately diversity and inclusion require vigilance. Because I think most of us in this room can probably speak to efforts that have been made to either check boxes, but without vigilance, what long-term impact has those efforts actually proven out? And I think, one of the reasons we are here where we are and why we're continuing to have this conversation is because the needle hasn't moved in the last 50 years. And so is there hope in this moment? I feel it, but I'm with Kat. I'm unsure of whether or not it will bear out because it hasn't before, and it's going to require a lot of work and vigilance in order for real change to happen.
Yeah, that's great. And that perfectly segues to my next question, which is, I'll address it to Mihir first, but I would love to hear all of our panelists' thoughts on this. Mihir, me and you discussed this a little bit yesterday, but the honest fact is that the majority of all of our colleagues on this panel are white. And in order for there to be true systemic change, which both Kat and Julia mentioned, we have to work together with our white colleagues, because that is the newsroom environment we are in, and that is how we create any change. How do you think we can do that without it being a burden on the journalists of color? And we talk about how much of a blurry line that could be in these types of situations.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenging question, and for me personally, because I think I've always approached it, and my thoughts on this are evolving, but in the places that I've worked and gone to school, I've always approached it looking at it, if I don't do something, if I don't, set up a committee or push for a letter or try to, push for an initiative, it's not going to happen, basically. So it's either I do it or nobody does it. And if I approach it that way, then it's like, I'm going to do it, basically. And, that's, if you're putting yourself in a position where you're constantly the only person who's pushing for something, I mean, it can actually be counterproductive probably in the long run. So what I've started thinking about a little bit more now is, okay, how can we make sure it's not a burden on just people from diverse backgrounds? Like, as you said, I mean, this is not our job. We're solving a problem that we did not create, by doing all this. I mean, this is stuff that should have never existed, frankly. But thinking about the reality that it is now, like how can we change things without, again, making it a burden? Well, one of the things I think it's important to think about is like, okay, how do we realign the incentives for people who might not have the experience that we do, who might not be in a situation where they're wondering, why am I thought of differently than another person or whatever, or why are white people constantly, reaching out to only white people for jobs and things like that. If you don't have that experience of like questioning or sort of feeling discriminated against even, then how do we realign incentives for those people? Well, one thing that I think the last few months have shown, or the last this reckoning has shown, is that external pressure can work in some cases, by a lot of people like raising their voices, saying like, hey, this is a problem, and a lot of people doing it together. That can put external pressure on, people who may not ever have thought to change how they do business, to actually think about, okay, we think about changing things. That's obviously, you have to question whether or not that'll work every single time, but it does work sometimes. Another thing I think that I've thought a little bit more about is like thinking about the personal relationships that I've built over the course of my career. you know, can I have like a heart-to-heart conversation with someone who I know is like my friend, who's white, and kind of explain to them, look, like maybe you don't understand what it's been like, and maybe you should, and maybe you should have educated yourself, but here I am educating you now, and perhaps because we're friends, like maybe you can trust me a little bit more, and you can put your own privilege at risk and put your own work in. So these are a couple ways that I've been thinking about this recently, but I would love to hear what other people think too.
Yeah, Yoli, Julia, Kat, if you guys have any thoughts on this. I do want to say one thing, and maybe Kat can speak on this too. At the AP, we've been doing a series of education programming, and one of them recently was on white privilege, which is something that, and I think most of us can talk about this, like even a journalist of color has an uncomfortable time bringing that up, because it's become this taboo thing where people get really defensive and they take it offensively when you even bring it up. So, and we had this entire education series on it, and it was really enlightening because it forced this conversation for the first time in a company like the AP, who's been around for so long. So I think like internal, and I agree on the internal and external pressures, and I will make note that like Mihir and his colleagues, all the internal pressure of what you guys did after the Tom Cotton op-ed is a perfect example of things that get attention, and things that journalists can do for each other, and your colleagues can do, we can do for our Black colleagues, and vice versa if the situation comes. But I would love to hear from any of the other panelists on what you think we can do to work with our white colleagues.
Yeah, to that point, I've been so impressed with, you know, what happened at the New York Times, but also the LA Times, in the sense of how they've been able to really use social media to bolster community support. I mean, that's just amazing to see the community, you know, readers actually get behind it. I think that's really a smart way to get the attention of the bosses, the editors in charge. But what I would say here is, you know, kind of what I've been telling folks is I feel like editors and newsroom managers at this point, they know what the problem is, right? You know, I'm at a place where it's kind of like, how many diversity committees do you need to identify the problem? When are we going to take this knowledge and move toward action? I would love to see from the top down, you know, editors really taking the first step to figuring out how to deal with these toxic newsroom environments that they have. Again, like I said, it's not enough to hire people. What's the point if you're just bringing them into these toxic environments? So I feel that the first step really needs to be for newsroom management to identify what are the problem areas and actually put in tangible steps to solve the issues. Because until that happens, you're just going to have a revolving door of talent constantly coming in and leaving your newsrooms. And that's what we're seeing across the board, right? So until we get to that point, I just don't think that the onus should be on the journalists of color. We have been saying for years what the issues are. We've been crying out for help in these newsrooms, and for so long our voices have been ignored. So now, in my mind, the buck is with them. You know, what are you going to do to solve this problem? Because we know that diverse newsrooms matter in the sense of the coverage that's going out into the community. So this isn't just a benefit for us, this is a benefit for our coverage.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that that's a point that so many people have made. Like, this is beyond doing the right thing. It's bad journalism when you don't have people that represent the communities that you color, when you don't have people that represent the stories or mindsets that we are all trying to cover in 2020, which is so diverse and beyond any of our understanding. So the more diversity you have of race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, geographical diversity, which I think is very often not discussed. I think that's the most important thing. I'll go to Yolanda next as a good way to get into what are some practices we can implement for this kind of work to be discussed long term and not just a fleeting discussion. Like, obviously we are taking a step here and having this discussion within within these minority groups that are very rarely come together, but I think more than ever, we've all realized how powerful we are when we do. So what are things we can do to move this needle forward?
Yeah, I think it falls, like, kind of going back to what we were talking about, like it is such a big burden on like journalists of color in your newsroom, and it's just very tiring and emotionally tiring to go through this. So I think I've seen like two avenues that I'm really impressed by with what happened at the New York Times and the LA Times. can't help but notice just how much protection those journalists had because they had a union behind them. And being able to speak up because there is a whole newsroom standing behind you, not just other journalists of color. I think that's really powerful. And that also takes away like the burden on just journalists of color to speak up. Obviously there are groups in the union that like focus on those issues, but having the whole mechanism of an organization behind you, that helps a lot. And I think I've also been really impressed by what's happening in Philadelphia and just seeing how the different affinity groups in the region have come together and are holding the local paper accountable. And it doesn't have to fall on just the journalists that work in that newspaper. It doesn't have to fall on journalists who left and like are speaking up. It helps keep newspapers accountable when there's outside pressure, and those outside actors are building their website, keeping track of what you have done or not done. And I think it's about sharing that burden because it's very tiring and sometimes you just don't want to deal with it. But if you know you have other affinity groups backing you up, if you have a union behind you, I think it just makes it slightly easier. But who knows if it's going to continue, but I am trying to be hopeful. Yeah.
Julia, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was thinking just to dovetail off of Yoli and Kat, one really specific way, specific, can't say that word anymore, case that I can really point to in which this pathway can exist and where it doesn't rest solely on the shoulders and the voices of journalists of color is, issues are elevated. So for example, and I'm going to try to get hella specific here, transparency in the hiring processes. That's something I think most folks here can relate to as being an issue. So that's something that has been elevated, identified, and so that is a theory to be borne out. Now, I know I'm using the word theory loosely because I think we all feel it and we all see it, but what we need to do as newsrooms is really do what we do best and report it out. So now that but the issue's been raised, the next step is really to start tracking because we're not exactly sure what the problems are because we have not been tracking hiring. We have not been tracking the open positions. We've not been tracking how far the reach has been for those job listings, and we have not been tracking who's applying and who ends up in the interview process and then who ends up getting hired. And I think there's a baseline of data there that we could glean a lot of information from that will help us start to figure out custom-made solutions to the custom-made problems that we have created as a news organizations. And so while I think there's a lot we can learn from each other, there are a lot of challenges, I think, that can be unique to certain newsrooms as far as how to tackle them. So this specific scenario has really been something I know I've been talking about in management meetings as far as, okay, well, do we revamp the hiring system? How do we build accountability? All of these really big questions all come back to, but we don't have data. We don't really know where to start. So why don't we start implementing, some really like blanket transparency processes? So for example, standardizing all job listings going up on the jobs website and going up for a minimum amount of time. That sounds really basic, but that may not be happening across your organization or across your newsroom. So the key is communication. And then the next step is really starting to track. And what I'm hoping that tracking does is start to reveal what exactly is happening. If job listings aren't going as far as wide and aren't reaching a pool of applicants that from a variety of backgrounds, why is that? Like, we just don't have enough data in order to begin to solve the problem. And so I think that is one way in which we push the ball forward. I'm really bad with cliches. Whatever the cliche is, move the needle, or at least attempt to move the needle, is really think about ways in which folks kind of are cycled in and out. So in this scenario, journalists of color came together and really are like, hey, this is a priority for us, more transparency in the hiring process. Great. And then from there, it needs to be on management. It needs to be on folks actually empowered to either run experiments or start a process for data tracking, for tracking some of this behavior in order for us to enact change and actually change the system, essentially. interesting for me to hear the challenges that exist, but I do, and maybe this, I'm just having a particularly optimistic day, I do feel like there are ways through, and there are ways where it doesn't solely rest on, because it can't. I think what we're feeling at this point is fatigue, and it's not sustainable. And so finding ways in which to make this kind of work manageable is the key to all of this. So that's one way. I just wanted to do my best to try to articulate that we have identified to attempt to solve a problem. And while we are doing this work, I think what would be helpful across the different journalism groups and our different communities is to kind of share these kind of ways of attempting to solve the problem. I don't think any of us can claim to be able to solve it because we haven't, but these attempts, I think, are going to be like the key points of interaction in which we have these really important discussions.
Definitely. And I think before we go and
ask one question, Julia, is that happening at KQED, and do you think that that's only happening because you're in like a position of management, perhaps, to be able to like push for that?
I think I'm helping. I'm one of a handful of journalists of color, or I should say BIPOC, in the organization that are able to make these decisions and able to enact some of these initiatives. So yes, I think if we weren't having the conversations we were having at the tables we're having them, that a lot of the initiatives that we are either talking about or have already started would not have started. No.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. And on one question I will ask all of you is, before we go into like really practical ways that our journalism organizations, the minority organizations can move forward, is, so we saw, I think, sometimes within days or weeks after the George Floyd protest, there was a number of news organizations that came out with like race beats and coverage of race. I think CNN like had 10 job postings. The Washington Post had 10 job postings, including someone on the masthead that would deal directly with race coverage in America. I really am interested in hearing, we've talked a lot about like, what can we do? What are ways we can do? So, and how important managers' roles are in this, and how important people on the mastheads, the people who get things actually moving, are in this. What are your guys' responses to those, what seems like knee-jerk reactions, and in my opinion, to be very honest, a little bit like PR moves of trying to fix things or put things in place that they didn't have before? What are you guys' responses to that, since I think every single person on this panel knows that race impacts every aspect of our coverage, whether it's economics or health, or covering a metropolitan community, or covering culture or entertainment or anything. So I'm interested in digging the few instances of what seems like intense action by news managers at major news organizations. What are you guys' responses to that? And do you think that these will be sustainable as we go past 2020?
I think it will just come down to retention. We'll see where these journalists end up in a year or two, if they're getting the big stories, if they're getting promoted. I'm just excited people get hired, but I don't know what these news organizations are going to provide or what kind of opportunities they'll be given. I hope it's good, but I think it's something we'll have to wait and see.
And I guess for me, my beat is covering race and ethnicity. It's kind of twofold for me. One, I think it's necessary. I think that news organizations need to, again, be intentional about covering race and what that looks like. But I would urge people to go beyond that and figure out how to incorporate race coverage into every single beat at your news organization. Like, as the race and ethnicity reporter at the AP, I should not be responsible for covering every single thing dealing with race. Sports, race intersects with sports, politics, every single beat in the newsroom needs to think about how race, class, economic status, how all of that fits into the beat. So I would just say, I think it's I am encouraged to see more people pay attention to the things that journalists of color have been talking about for decades now, but is it sustainable, and will they continue that coverage beyond it being the end thing to cover right now? That's the thing that I'm going to be watching to see. But I think it's important that hopefully they actually do make this a sustained coverage, because these issues aren't going anywhere, right? And the only thing that the COVID-19 pandemic has shown is how systemic and how rooted these issues are into the fabric of this nation, right? So we need to continue covering this beyond the headlines of today.
I think what concerns me about these, what can be seen as like bespoke initiatives or solutions or responses to the moment is that just that they're bespoke, that they're not how integrated into the overall newsroom strategy are these initiatives? Are these going to be the first things to go when budgets get tight? I think, back to the point of checking boxes, are these going to go the way of diversity panels, which again, we've seen don't make an impact. We're tired of them. Are these going to go the way in the tech industry, these like diversity positions, director of diversity, those we've seen not bear out in a pretty like quick time cycle. So I would like to know whether or not some of these initiatives, some of these positions, how they look in about how folks are thinking about them, how newsrooms are thinking about them in a year, in 3 years, in 5 years. And even if we can't look that far, and I think coronavirus, if anything, has shown us maybe we can't even plan further than a month out nowadays. But even in light of that, knowing that we are in the business of expecting the unexpected, what can we plan for? How can we assess these positions and these initiatives in a way that means their long-term sustainability in a news organization, because it is a priority? And I think it'll always come back to that. Is diversity, inclusion, is adding perspectives to framing and language, is that a priority for a news organization? And I think time will always tell how much a news organization prioritizes things. And so that's kind of how I'm looking at the situation. Time will tell us, but I'm hoping for the best. I'm hoping that these aren't just, quick responses to the moment, but actually things that maybe needed a nudge to happen in order for budget to be, found, magical pots of money somewhere in order to enact something that should have been enacted 10 years ago. And hopefully it means that folks are really planning out these initiatives' lives and their life cycles into one that integrates in a way that affects overall coverage. Because I agree with everything that Kat and Yoli has said. This can't be something that's siloed in a beat.
Yeah, and this is just to add on to that. What I meant to say earlier too is I think sometimes even myself, when I'm thinking about the problem, I think of it in like the bucket of diversity, and that everything sort of falls into this bucket, and it's kind of an oxymoron because diversity itself is, it's diversity. There's so many different issues that we have to deal with. There's so many different problems, and it's going to take a multi-pronged, different tier, like 1-year solutions, 5-year solutions, 10-year. It's going to take a really varied approach to addressing all of the different problems that are kind of in this bucket. So in that sense, to your question, I think maybe some of these things that are happening are one part of what needs to address everything that's in that bucket. That being said, I feel almost like very, very slight amounts of optimism about it. And that because I really do feel like some of this might happen and it might be, okay, we did it. Like we took care of like that issue. Now we can move on and go, do business as usual as we've been doing for decades, basically, which is what led to all these problems proliferating and festering for years. So, what do I think? I think I'm a little skeptical and I'm a little scared that we are not addressing the root causes of some of the things, and we're trying to slap a Band-Aid sometimes on these issues. And what I wait to Yoli's point, I'm waiting to see like when is the next shoe going to drop, like, and is it? And if it doesn't, I think that really does show where the priorities really lie, because this stuff on its own is not going to solve the problem. There are so many entrenched issues at so many different levels that we need to address. So.
Definitely. Sorry, go ahead,
I
Kat.
wanted to say one last thing that I forgot to say. And I think my weird, twisted optimism in this moment is coming from the fact that the demographics of this country are changing so quickly. And before we know it, newsrooms are going to be forced to deal with that fact because the readers are changing. You know, we're not going to have news reader bases that are predominantly white anymore, right? We're going to have to figure out how to tell the stories that readers really want to read and see. And I just think that the fact that the nation is being is changing right now, newsrooms are going to have to either adapt or, to be frank, die.
Yeah. One comment I want to make before we go into what can NAHJ, NABJ, AAJA, and SAJA do next is a point that Kat made on Twitter, I think a few days ago, about like breaking news reporters and how for a lot of journalists of color, they're entry level. That's how I got into news. That's how the majority of journalists of color or Black journalists get in, is through these and they're usually paid very bad. They usually overnight. They don't have health benefits, et cetera, et cetera. But they're how many journalists get in. And Kat made the point of like, we should stop seeing that as like the paying your dues job and the low level work, because that type of work, like those are the entryways where you start to see crime in cities. You start to see the patterns of activity within communities of color, within the relationship between police and those communities. Like those are where you get the basic understanding of what's happening in that city or in that rural community or in that state that you're covering. And I think that that's a really important point, because so often we look down on breaking news or as something that's easy that anyone can do, but it's an extremely taxing job, especially if anyone has worked overnight or past 10 p.m. You know that you have no social life and there's a lot of sacrifice you have to make. But I really do think that we should shift our views of how we look at positions like that, because so many of the younger generation will come in through positions like that, especially now since everything is breaking news. So I think it's important to shift our focus on that. But the next thing I want to talk about is, obviously we have our panelists are representing major minority organizations, and we kind of wanted to talk about how we could work together or separately in doing better as far as being an ally, with whether it's within our own programming, whether it's a mentorship program that taps into each of our member groups and picks journalists, like a young Asian American journalist with a NABJ, a person who's in NABJ leadership or whatever that is. And so I would love to ask our panelists, like, what are things we can do forward? And I'll give an example of that, of something we did recently, SAJA did with AAJA, is when Kamala Harris was nominated as the vice president for Biden's campaign. SAJA and AAJA quickly and very promptly and timely got together and put a really nice style memo on how Kamala wants to be identified and how the news media should identify her. And I think that those are angles and moments in time where I think groups like ours are so important, and journalism organizations should tap into these resources that we have, and not just when there's a breaking news, not just when the vice president is half Asian and half South Asian, but at all times. And I want to ask you guys, what are ways like that? What are like ingrained foundational ways we can work together or create systems of communication where we can join together, not just when things are in disarray, but for long term?
Yeah, I can go ahead and just start. You mentioned that that style memo, and I think part of what enabled that to happen so quickly and to happen at all is, I've been an AAJA member for a long time myself, and I know a lot of folks in AAJA, and we just very quickly started talking and decided to do something. So I think laying that groundwork of communication and familiarity with people in different organizations, just getting to know people and say, like, this is what we do, this is what our priorities are, this is what our capabilities are, this is what, we have, like, people that work at these organizations, just laying some of that groundwork, I think, would be a great way to start. And, you know, being the president of SAJA, that's something that I can initiate and I can sort of commit to. So, you know, that is something that I plan to do like a lot more of going forward with all the organizations, different organizations. That's one thing. Another thing that you mentioned briefly, and I'll mention just briefly again, is, you know, I think a lot of different organizations have mentorship programs where they pair, you know, younger members with more experienced members based on certain criteria. And I've talked with the AAJA a little bit about, you know, perhaps doing something like that together, but maybe that's something that we can all do, like, again, overall together, where we can just really start making connections and making relationships that would really benefit the membership of all of our organizations. And finally, and this will be the last thing I say, I think there's a lot that can be said about amplifying people and amplifying like certain people's work and their narratives and things like that, because that can really make a difference in someone's career if their boss sees, oh, hey, like this person's really getting noticed for like X or Y or whatever. So maybe as organizations, we can do better about amplifying the work of some of each other's members, perhaps, to really, again, try to make that difference.
So I'm going to jump off of everything that you two have said because I have running for the VP of Civic Engagement role. I did have a dream initiative around what a public style guide could look like if all the JOC orgs collabed on it, just because, and even within the AAJA community, there's so many ways in which it needs to be updated, so many ways in which we could be talking about our different communities together, and advising media in general, or advising other communities on how to talk about, you know, Samoan Americans, and when, you know, things happen in the different parts of our community, because we're not a monolith. So expanding that out, like, I just think, and if in all full transparency, this is work I'm doing at KQED too, is really redoing its style guide. And so having already been steeped in this work, it's something that just is so tangible and is so ripe for collaboration, and is something that not just we could use among ourselves, but would be valuable to the industry at large and the public. And it's such a great engagement opportunity if you think about it. I could really go off on this idea for a while because it's something I've been noodling for the last couple of months, but I really think, Mihir, you're the president of SAJA. I got you right here. Like, you know, already I can say SAJA and AJA, or AAJA, however you want to pronounce it. You know, we've already gone ahead with, you know, the Kamala Harris memo. I think that we could expand that, you know, and, you know, with NABJ and NAHJ, we could really be putting together an ultimate style guide in a way that is really us kind of uniting and really informing the greater industry at large around issues that we are the experts in.
Yeah, let's totally do it.
Yay.
I guess two of the things that I would like to see, I would love to see some of the local chapters, you know, of NABJ, NAHJ, whatever, all of our organizations work together in specific markets, because we know our markets better than anyone else, right? So like in Detroit, is there something that's happening in a particular newsroom here? Is there something that we could come together to work together around to identify issues and how to solve it? So I would like to see all of the organizations use their local chapters more, I think, because they're right there, right? And they could feed us, you know, at the national level and tell us what's going on the ground. So I would love to have some brainstorming around that. But also, you know, kind of building off of AS&E's effort, you know, in terms of like taking stock of who's in the newsrooms, I would like to see our organizations go beyond that and kind of start to look at these very specific roles that are often unattainable for journalists of color, political beats, investigative reporting beats, a lot of those newsroom beats that for a very long time we have not been in, right? And I feel like often when you're counting these positions in the newsrooms, we are often in those early career roles. We're often in those breaking news roles. So I would like to see someone take a real stock of who's leading the political coverage for the election or who's leading these investigative units. So those are two of the things that come to the top of my mind.
So I really like data and data reporting, and something that I thought of months or weeks after we had the virtual conference, NAHJ, NABJ virtual conference. It's like there was so much interest from employers to come talk to people coming to the conference and interview, and like they really wanted to hire people of color. And I think using that enthusiasm and getting data out of people that are trying to hire us would be like a great like move. I'm not on the NHJ board, I just help with the programming of the conference, but like something I definitely want to share with other people. I think if anyone wants to post a job in our career page, if anyone wants to recruit any of our members, why don't we have them also fill out a form that tells us how many journalists of color do you have in your newsroom? What is the retention rate, or who's getting promoted? Because obviously there's the ASME, I don't know how to say it, but like that big like annual report that would come out on diversity in newsrooms that only like 10, 15, 20% of like newsrooms actually filled out. So something I think about is like, if they want to like get the good PR and like say they're hiring us, then share your data with us, share your numbers with us. Tell us if your newsroom has other Latinas working and you're not going to be the only one. That's something I want to know. And if I'm going to be applying for a job and you're trying to recruit me, that's something you should be willing to share. And if you're not sharing it with ASME, then maybe share it with NABJ, NHJ, and AAJA, and SAJA.
I love that, because those conversations are already happening. When people are job searching, they're sliding into each other's DMs, asking how diverse is that newsroom? You know, is it a good place for a journalist of color? You know, what are the challenges? What are the opportunities? And to actually standardize that would be amazing.
Mihir, did you want to go ahead?
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say also, I mean, you know, I think often we talk about like the ideas, and sometimes I wonder what people see as the biggest obstacles perhaps to like being able to do some of this stuff or working together. And maybe that's another, like, I mean, I'm just curious what everyone else sees. I mean, one of the things I think that we at SAJA is challenging sometimes is what kind of bandwidth do we have? Like, you know, we're an all-one volunteer organization, like how much can we do, and how can we effectively communicate like what our capabilities are to other people if we want to like work together on something. And that was just something that came to mind, because I'm just curious if the rest of y'all have seen other challenges or other obstacles that have maybe prevented successful collaboration from happening in the past, and is there some way to maybe get around that?
Yeah, definitely. I think if anyone wants to respond to that, I think it's really important for us to kind of not tiptoe around any issues that could arise or could come up, or any barriers. I know it's really hard to kind of create these relationships and maintain them. We're all so extremely busy, but I think this is like a really good step forward. So if anyone wants to share things that maybe SAJA could help NABJ with, or NABJ can help AAJ, I think that this is like the power in this conversation, is that we all have such wide span member groups and reach, and I think we can fill in gaps that we might have in our organization.
And I'll also just add to that, Kat, something you mentioned, which is looking at the local level too. I mean, you know, each of our organizations have chapters, and I think even beyond that, you know, every organization, every like journal, like a company, often has like their own groups inside. I mean, so I think the lessons that, you know, we talk about can apply on so many different levels, perhaps not just at the big, whatever, broad national level, perhaps.
I mean, just even on a basic level, is there a way to get, you know, the presidents of each of our organizations in a room together just for a monthly, bi-monthly talk, just to kind of talk about the issues that they're seeing or the things that they want to take up, or initiatives? I mean, one of the things that we've kind of run into with NABJ is a lot of our members have stated they want more training. They want to gain more skills around data, but they're not quite comfortable joining IRE yet because they feel like it's not welcoming for journalists of color. You know, I hear that a lot, even though I'm involved with IRE. So like, is that an opportunity? Like, can we be offering more workshops together, you know, on how to cover, you know, specific communities of color? So I'm just thinking like from that very basic level, maybe we just need to get all of our presidents in the room together to kind of start this conversation and relationship.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think that's completely doable. Like if all of us can come on here, and I got SAJA's president to come on, I think we can get the rest of everyone on. And that's the thing, is like, we can't just stop after this Zoom call. Everything that we've discussed on here are major issues, and are vitally important as we go into an election year, as we go into covering the greatest recession in our generation, as we go into whatever is the outcome of this pandemic, if it ever ends. I think it's important for us to move forward in that way. So I'm glad we can start to have these conversations. But yeah, it's a good segue for if anyone of our guests have any questions for the panelists. You can either can they unmute themselves here, or do we have to unmute them?
They cannot unmute themselves, but maybe they can either, if they want to ask like privately, maybe they message it to you directly and you can ask for them, or they can just ask a question in the public chat.
Yeah, either ask a question in the chat, or you can ask to be unmuted, and one of us can unmute you. So please come forward with any questions you have. Oh, yes, John. Go here, let me unmute him. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, I just wanted to add to what Julia and Yoli referred to. One thing that I think we can do together, by the way, I'm with SAJA and very familiar with the other organizations as well, but we haven't really worked together as much as we should have. A few things that we can easily do, I think, in the current context. Julia mentioned the power of data. We live in the age of data, not only asking employers for information of how diverse their workforce is when we apply for jobs, but on a regular basis, the 4 organizations could pool together, maybe even form a task force to require major organizations to report this data to us. HR data is usually very confidential, but aggregated data should be available, should be reported. It's a self-policing thing. People can be, news organizations can be proud of showing this data. In most of the other fields, ESG, environmental social governance, is becoming a big factor in corporate governance now. And all corporations are now forced to report their performance in these environmental social governance metrics. Similarly, we should be able to ask major organizations to voluntarily provide information, pull this together, and then publish it periodically once a year. Not to necessarily police, not to ask for quotas or anything like that, but just to provide this information. It's a self-reinforcing thing. The other thing I think we should be doing, I'm now involved in trying to modernize our website. And one of the things I'm trying to do is to make connections to the other organizations' website. If there's an event that AAJA is holding or the other organizations are holding, there should be a link in our website to your events. In your website, there should be a link to the events that we are holding, because we don't really compete with one another. Our groups are really basically collaborators, because any one of us qualified as a better way to bring diversity, not just because one is South Asian or South Asian, just simply because we have brought diversity to the pool. And so I think we can do that through the our websites, and the way we make announcements of our events, we make announcements of our programs. And this data collection effort, I think, is something that we can do outside the offline. We can discuss creating a task force of the organizations, and then approaching all the major organizations and getting the information and publishing it. Nothing like information. Information is power.
Yeah, thanks, John. I will ask one of the questions in the chat by, I'm so sorry if I pronounced your name wrong, Raida. I feel like we only see the push for diversity from larger organizations through job postings, social media, etc. And it's only once they take action can it ripple and affect smaller local newsrooms or even student papers. Even then, it might not ripple because of power dynamics and the need to work and get started in the industry. Without that union group backing, how can these smaller organizations push for a systematic shift in diversity practices, or can they? If anyone wants to answer that.
I think that's where like the power of the local chapters really comes in. And like pointing again to Philadelphia, I just seeing all those groups come together, speak up, and like support each other. Philadelphia is not a small city, but it is not considered one of the big markets, LA, New York, San Francisco. And just, I think, especially in smaller places, maybe there is not a lot of us. And that's when working together really is more impactful, because having 2 people demand change is not super impressive. But if you have 20 people in one market really like push for it, I think that helps people, when you're not in the bigger cities. And hopefully, communicating between the local chapters and the national chapters. I think there should be like 2-way communication. If there's something that like the national organization can do to help the local groups, that would be really powerful too.
Mm-hmm.
And just kind of building off of that, you know, thinking about the whole point of this panel, allyship, right? What about, is there someone in the newsroom that can advocate, that can kind of, you know, help you with this, you know, whether it's a, not necessarily a person of color, but, you know, kind of putting some pressure on our white colleagues to step up. I mean, they know that these issues exist, right? So are you with us or not? I mean, that's really where I'm at this point. You know, is there someone in the newsroom that could kind of, you know, be there with you to advocate for some change? I think that this is the time, hopefully, for our white colleagues to step up and help us in this fight that we've been leading by ourselves for far too long.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we have time for one more question. This one is from Mary Bell. It is, what advice do you have for mid-career journalists of color struggling to climb the career ladder? And obviously this is open to anyone on the panel.
I mean, just having, you know, again, part of the point of this panel is like these organizations, SAJA, organizations like that exist to provide the network to try and, you know, help you through your career. You know, I'll put my email in the chat, and I'm open to, you know, if anyone ever has a question or anything like that, I'm open to, you know, talking about having currently experiencing some of these issues, having experienced some of them in the past, you know, maybe, and there's other people that perhaps we can all connect you with. But, you know, in my experience, like all these organizations have been like, that is part of their very purpose. So joining one, going to events if you can, going to virtual events right now if you can, just being part of that is one way you could do that.
This is not an answer, but I will say the reason why this question is hard to answer is for good reason. It means that the traditional ways in which folks kind of come up in journalism, from reporter to senior reporter, and then what? Maybe editor, senior editor. Those pathways are still deeply grooved in, but there's way more now, depending on what your platform is, what your interests are. I mean, I think there's so many ways to answer that question depending on where you want to go. So some really like blanket advice I would give is, because of this like flaring of ways in which, you know, avenues have presented themselves in the last decade, I would say, you know, whose career it matches well with kind of where you see your different trajectories. If you were to map out several kind of dream paths, is there anyone that you see out there that kind of matches that, and are you able to reach out to them to have a conversation? That's, you know, having a roadmap, a professional roadmap with several, if not dozens, of different pathways kind of spelled out has been one way that I've been, you know, that I've tried to really figure out what it is I want to do. Because once you kind of hit mid-career, depending on how focused you are as far as platform or beat or format, it could really go so many different ways. And then if you get into management, it can mean actually several of these buckets. So this is where like mentorship really kind of comes in, which is why I would say, yeah, try to find some models of pathways that you see out there in the world and see if you can have a conversation with those folks.
Yeah. Okay, we are coming up on an hour. I want to thank our panelists so much for taking the time. I know all of us have like 700 of these Zoom calls a day, but this is has been an extremely important and an honest conversation I think we've all had about allyship and what that means in the newsroom. And definitely please reach out. Mihir put his email address, and Kat also kindly did as well. We are all open to mentorship or helping you find someone who can do that. And SAJA, I think Mihir wants to mention a few last words about SAJA before we go.
Yeah, so thank you everyone to coming. Again, thank you to my co-panelists. I mean, thanks for volunteering your time. I think that was helpful to me, and I've written down several of these ideas. I'll just say this is the first event of SAJA's 2020. I don't know if you want to call it a conference, call it whatever you want. We posted a light schedule online. There'll be more details coming, and we'd love to see everyone at all of these events. Doesn't matter which group you're part of or whatever. So again, thank you so much, and I look forward to connecting with you all in the future.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Have a good night. Okay, I'm gonna log off to here. Bye.